Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Delighted to be joined by Kevin Gosztola with The Dissenter. Kevin's, in my view, been the leading journalist in America covering the Julian Assange prosecution, I believe persecution. Pretty major news early in America time coming from the UK, and that is the High Court in Great Britain has allowed for a full appeal for Julian Assange to go forward. So he will not, at least right now, be extradited to the U.S. Kevin, it seems like the UK's grant of an appeal is on pretty narrow point. What did they decide?
Yeah. So first off, just to take a step back, at any moment, and I think we need to say this anytime we have a conversation and update people on Assange news, at any moment, President Joe Biden, Attorney General Merrick Garland, and any other officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, whose department has offered assurances about how Julian Assange will be treated, they could support withdrawing these charges, ending the case, and set Julian Assange free. As a close ally, Australia's Prime Minister and their parliament have demanded. But we are here, and the news is that Julian Assange will get an appeal hearing probably in a couple of months or so. We don't have a date, but it will be on this very narrow issue, although an important issue, of First Amendment rights. And whether during trial, or I guess it would probably be pre-trial proceedings before they got to the trial, would he be able to make a First Amendment challenge and say that if he had First Amendment rights, this case would have never been brought against him in the first place. And so we don't know what will come from that kind of the argument that will take place during this appeal hearing. But it is important to be clear because there are a few reports out there that are saying granted full appeal. There are supporters, advocates saying this is a full appeal. Everyone should be reminded that the High Court rejected somewhere around 7 or 8 grounds of appeal and really considerably narrowed the challenge that Julian Assange could make to extradition, and that was back in March.
And my understanding is the U.S. Prosecutors going after Assange were kind of hemming and hawing in this proceeding this morning, basically saying, ultimately it would be up to the trial judge how to enforce that he would be granted First Amendment rights, so that the U.S. lawyers cannot guarantee to the UK High Court that he would be granted First Amendment rights, because it would be up to judge at trial.
Right. So I think the issue for the High Court of Justice is that under the European Convention on Human Rights, there are very clearly set out protections for freedom of expression. But what can be found in US case law is that someone's rights to freedom of expression when they are put on trial in the United States can be different depending on whether they are a US citizen or not. It's been acknowledged in cases, this isn't controversial, the Supreme Court has even upheld it, that foreign nationals, and that's what Julian Assange is as an Australian, and he has no ties to the United States. So given that, it's not out of line for the United States government to say, based on the law, that Julian Assange would not have First Amendment rights. The trouble is, and what they're running into, is that this might end up sinking their extradition request, because then there's an argument that Julian Assange will be prejudiced due to his nationality during a trial, in the sense that if he was a US citizen, he would have a much better chance at challenging the charges. At least that's what Julian Assange would like to argue. Now, there's a lot that we can get into, and I think there'll be plenty of time further down the road to go through those issues. But the problem that the High Court is looking at and why they granted this appeal hearing is because it looks like there is an issue here of prejudice when it comes to Julian Assange's being an Australian. And so I should also say make sure that I note that there was an assurance put forward related to his exposure to the death penalty, the risk that he could be sentenced to death. And the Assange legal team accepted it as an assurance. And the reason they accepted it is because it actually is in the power of the executive branch to not seek the death penalty for Julian Assange. And so that's within their power. But what is not within their power is to make an assurance about the First Amendment, because that's going to be up to a court. And that's completely out of the hands of the U.S. government. And so the U.S. government can't really go before the High Court of Justice and make an assurance about the First Amendment that would satisfy the High Court. So the U.S. government, I actually don't care that they're in this position, but they're in this position where they really can't promise what the High Court of Justice wants them to promise when it comes to Julian Assange.
And I want to play Julian Assange's wife, Stella Assange, outside the court responding to this decision.
The judges reached the right decision. We spent a long time hearing the United States putting lipstick on a pig, but the judges did not buy it. As a family, we're relieved. But how long can this go on? The United States should read the situation and drop this case now. Now is the moment to do it. Just abandon this shameful attack on journalists, on the press, and the public that has been going on for 14 years.
So that's just some of what she said. Something we should also note, Assange, once again, was not present due to his health. His health has been deteriorating for years, physical and mental. But I want to laser in because you tweeted out something. The United States, they claim that Assange is not, quote, a responsible journalist. That's kind of part of their case. Well, if we're going to be indicting and prosecuting with up to 175 years in prison, people who are not, quote, responsible journalists, I could offer up at least 50 off the top of my head, or they're not journalists at all, but they get paid like ones. I digress. But this seems to be the center because the U.S. seems to want to have it both ways. They're saying his activity, or they've been saying his activity is not protected under freedom of the press, but then they can't give assurances that he would even be able to argue the First Amendment. So am I getting that wrong, that their case is basically distinguishing that he's not protected as a journalist, but they can't even offer him that defense?
It's convoluted like that. I mean, you're in the right place because what they're saying doesn't add up. I mean, if Julian Assange doesn't have First Amendment rights, then the issue for the High Court of Justice is where does he get his rights to freedom of expression that are supposed to be, in the view of the European Convention on Human Rights, recognized. Okay, so the U.S. will have this problem with the European Court of Human Rights if it would get to that stage. If this appeal failed and it doesn't stop the extradition, then they'll go and they'll seek an injunction to stop extradition from the European Court on Human Rights, and then we'll have the same argument about how the U.S. doesn't adequately protect freedom of expression or Julian Assange's right to freedom of expression is being violated. Now, the High Court has accepted the argument, which I don't agree with, and press freedom groups don't agree with, and all kinds of human rights and parliamentarians, all these attorneys, everyone say no to it. But they have accepted that Julian Assange was engaged in conduct that is outside what is typically conduct of a journalist, of an investigative journalist. I disagree. The ACLU has put forward pretty good arguments, the Knight First Amendment Institute, and pointed to how the indictment criminalizes standard news gathering activities. So we're talking about using encrypted chat. We're talking about using a secure Dropbox to asking a source to submit information to a secure Dropbox. encouraging source protection or seeking to protect the identity of your sources. These are standard news gathering activities, and Julian Assange is being treated as a criminal for doing this, allegedly, in a chat with Chelsea Manning, who is the source of the documents at issue in this case. And so basically what you're saying is true, because when they get to a court, he should be able to argue that what he was doing would not be charged against a US-based journalist because of this accepted status quo that you don't bring prosecutions against US reporters. I would say that Julian Assange is being prosecuted because he is a foreign national and he exists in this kind of gray area that the United States is taking advantage of by keeping him in this legal limbo, punishing him by process, and waging this war on him and WikiLeaks.
And not that you're, a lawyer. Do you believe that, common sense, you would think as part of an appeal, one of the top bullet points would be, here's Yahoo News' story that the United States CIA was plotting to kidnap and assassinate Julian Assange under President Trump. Is there a way to weave that into the First Amendment appeal? Because, yes, you have to kind of tailor it to the narrow First Amendment scope, but it just seems you don't have to be a legal expert. Obviously, if they were plotting and discussions were made, in fairness, it was under Trump, not Biden, but the CIA nonetheless, to kidnap and assassinate him, that this goes far beyond what they're claiming his crimes were.
Yeah. So how about I'm going to read this bit from the High Court, which basically, had the objection about the First Amendment, just so everyone's clear on what the High Court is upset, why they're allowing this to go forward. And again, just to be certain that nobody gets the wrong impression, this is a win for Julian Assange today, but winning feels like losing because he doesn't get out of jail. He's going to stay in Belmarsh prison, and his mental and physical health will continue to deteriorate. But
and I just want to interrupt for a second. It should be noted at this point, when you factor in Belmarsh prison and the Ecuadorian embassy, he's been detained longer than Chelsea Manning was. Chelsea Manning was imprisoned, I believe, 7 years when President Obama commuted her sentence.
So we're getting close. We're not there yet. We just hit the 5-year mark on this, but include the embassy, and I think that would be. You could also include the time that he was under house arrest in the UK, although that was unrelated. That involved the sexual allegations. But again, the fact is that a UN working group on arbitrary detention back in 2016, 2017, maybe a little earlier, recognized that he had been living under arbitrary detention. And so I just want to read to you what the High Court is saying, because this is why they're giving Julian Assange this appeal hearing, this limited appeal. Assange wishes to argue at trial that if he was granted First Amendment rights, then the prosecution would be stopped. So then the quote is that the First Amendment is therefore of central importance to his defense to the extradition charge. Further, if he is convicted, he may wish to invoke the First Amendment on the question of sentence. If he is not permitted to rely on the First Amendment because of his status as a foreign national, he will thereby be prejudiced, potentially very greatly prejudiced, by reason of his nationality. Now, this is where we get to the lead prosecutor in this case. His name is Gordon Kromberg. He works in the Eastern District of Virginia, and he's overseeing this case. He might very well argue this case if Julian Assange was brought to trial. And Kromberg made a formal sworn declaration on behalf of the United States and in support of the extradition request, and he put himself forward as able to provide authoritative assistance as to the application of the First Amendment. It can fairly be assumed that he would not have said that the prosecution could argue that foreign nationals are not entitled to protections under the First Amendment unless that was a tenable argument that the prosecution was entitled to deploy with a real prospect of success. Finishing up here, if such an argument were to succeed, it would at least arguably cause the applicant prejudice on the grounds of his non-U.S. citizenship and hence on the grounds of his nationality. And so that is why Julian Assange is owed a appeal. And the idea here is that if you extradite some person to a requesting state, and the requesting state is the U.S. government, they should have the same shot at arguing their innocence or defending themselves against accusations of guilt as anybody else that would be, I guess, in that country, or anyone who would be extradited to that country for trial. There shouldn't be this disparate treatment for people of different nationalities throughout the world.
Right. And over the next few months, what is the process? Is the U.S. government now going to be asked to provide some more, evidentiary evidence that he would be afforded First Amendment rights? Or is it now just on Assange's legal team, to more formalize a formal legal appeal explaining why he would be prejudiced? It seems from the way I read it today that the U.S. lawyers basically said they cannot, definitively, like they definitively gave assurances against he would not receive the death penalty. They've already said that they cannot definitively do that for the First Amendment. So it seems if that is what the appeal is over, that Assange has a decent shot at prevailing.
Yeah, so the next step here is to figure out what the schedule will be. That's kind of bureaucratic and tedious for your viewers, but by May 24th, we should know exactly when this hearing is likely to take place. And then it will be mostly a rehash of these arguments that were heard today, I'd imagine. Again, this is just basically the tedious nature of court procedure. You go before the judges and you seek permission to appeal. And then now today we saw that the U.S. was putting forward their assurances to stop the appeal. And the court said, well, that one's good, especially because Assange accepts the assurance on the death penalty. But this one on the First Amendment, they reject, and we actually think that they have some arguable points. So since there are arguable points, there now gets to be a hearing where we mostly will hear the same back and forth between the prosecutor and the defense team for Julian Assange. And so once we get there to that hearing, the main thing we'll be looking for is, will the High Court of Justice actually take a stand and block the extradition if they find that Assange's legal team's points are as persuasive as they seem. And they seem to be very rooted in the case law, and it seems to follow from a point of logic that I think is pretty obvious, and I would imagine people who are watching this conversation, our interview here, would see that it's pretty obvious. If the High Court of Justice says that the First Amendment should be available to Julian Assange, but the U.S. can't give an assurance that makes that a definite likelihood, then they should not be able to get Julian Assange on a plane, bring him to the U.S., and put him on trial. Of course, then, will the High Court of Justice stop this extradition and create tension between the United States and the UK over Julian Assange? I think that that's... I'm very skeptical, because so far throughout the last 5 years, we've seen that these judges in the UK court system are constantly prioritizing what the US government is saying and basically acting as if nothing can be viewed in bad faith because they're close diplomatic partners.
Then my last question. Well, first, for people watching, because this can get complicated, and a lot of times people wonder, is this the last step? This next step, which is Assange's appeal, is the final step, meaning if the court in the next ruling will rule whether he's being extradited or not.
Yes, right.
Okay.
So the next hearing, they'll hold the hearing and they can issue a decision on that day, or they can take it under advisement and adjourn the court, and then we wait for several weeks or however long they would like, and then they rule against the extradition.
Which brings me...
If there's a question in the back of people's heads about the political issue of Joe Biden running for president, and if they're looking at this timeline and sensing that it looks like Julian Assange might not be an issue for Joe Biden or Donald Trump during this election year, that's a very astute observation, because what these courts are effectively doing, even if it's not deliberate, is kicking this can down the road so that it becomes an issue in 2025. And so if the UK court, this appeals court that just heard these arguments and granted the appeal hearing, if they side with Assange and now the US government has to appeal, they'll go to the UK Supreme Court. So if Assange wins at this level, there's a level that's higher where the US government can turn to save their extradition request. So we're going to see how far the Biden administration will go to fight for charges against a journalist that were first issued by Donald Trump.
That's my last question. This makes you kind of a political pundit, which I don't want to do. But in my view, Biden obviously does not care about the polls or public sentiment when it comes to Israel. By the way, the International Criminal Court just issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu, the defense minister of Israel, as well as Hamas's leaders. Nothing's going to come of it. I mean, they've had an arrest warrant for Putin for years, but it is historic. The Prime Minister of Israel has had an arrest warrant issued for him. But technically, Biden could face serious embarrassment because this calendar year before the election, the UK court could at least rule against the US. That doesn't mean... So theoretically, Biden has, in interviews, said he will consider Australia's request to drop this. I mean, it would be politically advantageous for him, particularly with a lot of voters he's losing, if he dismisses this case. Now, I'm not asking, do you think he will? But do you think that comes into the equation at all for Biden, or is this much bigger than Biden? And this is like the military-industrial complex, and you don't really think Biden's ultimately he's making a decision, but there's higher forces, shall we say, a deep state, really behind this?
My assessment of what we've observed is that the executive is already making political decisions in Julian Assange's case. So they like to say that they need to let the process unfold. The Justice Department issued these charges when Donald Trump was president, and it's not political. That's their argument, that they just arrived at the indictment at this time. And because he was expelled by Ecuador, which was a pressure campaign that Mike Pompeo orchestrated while Trump was president, that now they were able to indict him. And so I reject that idea. I reject this idea that it hasn't been political, because the State Department is the one putting forward these assurances, and those are essentially promises by the executive branch. So in other words, people might not see that Biden or the Trump administration would handle Assange differently, but Biden's assurances can be different than Trump's assurances when it comes to the high court. This is whatever the executive has the power to do outside of the court system, basically. And so that comes to how you would jail or imprison somebody who's extradited. It involves things like access to mental health care in a facility. What is not in their purview is how a court will apply the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to Julian Assange. They really don't have any power over that at all, and nor do I think they want to change how the courts have applied. I think they're perfectly happy with excluding people like Julian Assange. And so to me, this is a political issue already. And the fact of the matter is that, that Joe Biden is not upset that this is going to be delayed. And I would say that in the end, there's not going to probably be any consequences for Joe Biden if the court rules against him. What it'll just mean is that they have a shot to revive it and maybe get a favorable Supreme Court ruling after the election. Now, what we get is an odd representation of the politics in this farce, which is to say that if the polls play out the way that the polls are playing out, if everything plays out the way that we are observing, and there are consequences for Joe Biden because he's backing this genocidal assault by Israel in the war on Gaza, and if that means that he can't turn out people that he needs to turn out on election day to vote for him, and they all stay home, many of these people stay home, and Donald Trump is back in office, then I just would like to emphasize that we will see that this process against Julian Assange has unfolded where Donald Trump indicted, left office, Donald Trump's people indicted, they left office. Joe Biden had a chance to stop the case. He didn't. He co-signed it and then left because he got defeated, and Trump will be back in office and then gets to actually finally bring Julian Assange to the U.S. for a trial, which is probably one of the most bizarre things that I could have scripted. I don't think if you put that in an actual film, I think it would seem ridiculous.
And I'm going to have you back. Have to bring my daughter somewhere. You know how that is. But there's other issues we need to discuss in a separate interview. Number one, if he's extradited, the case would be in Virginia. You want to talk about prejudice against Julian Assange? I mean, most of the people on a trial or potential jury, we directly or indirectly would be somehow associated with government, the CIA, NSA, defense contractors. I mean, sure, you could find, the retired librarian to sit on the jury, but it is an area that is by geography connected to the U.S. government, not to mention a whole lot of other concerns. So we'll have to follow up. Kevin, where can people find this work that you've been doing? It's not just you. You've had other journalists working on this particular story, which to me is the number one story if you care about freedom of the speech. All these media hysterics about democracy is at stake. It's right in front of you. If you believe, if we even have a democracy, which I think is, arguable, there's no bigger story. So how could people support your work?
Yeah, and let me just say quickly that there's a few times there that I blinked. I've been up since 4:30 in the morning. So if I don't seem as coherent, but yeah, I get up.
By the way, he's been up since 4:30 because he has to follow the UK timeline. Yes. So yes. He's been up many times at 4 a.m., 4:30 Chicago time. Yeah, because this is happening in the UK. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so I was denied access. I just wanted to make that clear very quickly here that I know you have to run, but I just want everybody to know that the UK courts, in one of the most important cases in the history of global journalism, has taken a position that any international reporter must get their butts to the England jurisdiction or be in Wales if they would like video access or to actually go to the courtroom. Because obviously you'd have to be there if you're going to the courtroom. But in order to get video access, you have to be in their jurisdiction so that they can hold you in contempt and jail you if you don't follow their rules. So I no longer am getting video access that I was getting for previous hearings. And so I've hired Mohammed Almazi, who's a London-based reporter, and he'll have a report at the dissenter.org, THEDISSENTER.org. StatusCoup.org, firsthand reporting from the press conference after the court hearing, and also being there at the Royal Courts of Justice. So that's where you can find the work and the continuous updates on the Assange case.
Thank you. We'll put the link in the description. Thank you for waking up very early, so the rest of us do not have to do that. And thank you for staying on this. It's very, very important, and we'll schedule another conversation about this.